Greetings and welcome to the latest episode of the Psychedelic Podcast. No, the Elevate Podcast. Maybe it will become the Psychedelic Podcast after this conversation. Today we're talking about how psychedelics can help us make sense of the world with Alexander Beiner, who is one of our returning guests. He's been with us previously talking about how we can make sense of the madness and everything that's going on in the world, looking at sense-making techniques and approaches that can help us to understand the complexities and nuances of the world. In many ways, we're returning to that subject, but also now through the lens of psychedelics specifically, and how psychedelics can not only help us or potentially help us understand and make sense of the world, but actually look at how psychedelics can perhaps inform our understanding around how we can approach systems change, which many of our audiences will know is one of the two components of systems change and sense making are vital components of our conversation on the show. So Alexander, it's absolutely amazing to have you back in lieu of your book launch, which is happening this week, which we'll talk about. Welcome back to the Elevate Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's very good to be back and to be in conversation again.
So I just want to put it front and center. Your book is coming out. We saw it in the intro there. The bigger picture, how psychedelics can help us make sense of the world. Coming out on Monday, is that right?
Tuesday. Yes, but it is either way, very soon from now.
Great.
Which I'm excited about.
Well, of course, we're going to talk about the book. We'll put the links in the notes. I've already pre-ordered my copy and encouraged the audience to do the same. But just to get us started, psychedelics, sense-making, systems changed. How did you come across the intersection of these elements? And then I suppose I'd like to know the history of what took you on that journey, and then almost zooming right back into today into how it came into fruition through the book.
Yeah, so I think my entry into the whole world of being interested in systems change and sense-making, I could trace back to my psychedelic experiences, my very first ones, which were obviously, as they are for many people, incredibly profound and meaningful. But also, I had the sense that they were incredible sense-making tools. I wouldn't have framed it like that in the past. But one of the things psychedelics help us do is to zoom out and widen our perceptual frames. And so that we know that from the neuroscience, we know it from the cognitive science as well. And so as John Vervaeke points out, the whole phrase getting high is actually kind of points to what's going on cognitively, is that we're zooming out, we're getting a bigger picture of what's going on. We're seeing more connections between things. We're getting a sense of a much richer emotional experience, a much richer perceptual experience. We know psychedelics can enhance creativity and also cognitive flexibility, which is a really key aspect of sense making. And so that process where we widen our frames has the potential to really allow us to see more of reality. It also has the potential to allow us to fall into rabbit holes and delusions. And so there's a really important caveat there. What matters is using and navigating that experience well with enough preparation and the right skills. Then what's particularly interesting to me is that the same skills that you need to navigate a psychedelic experience can be exacted. That's a word from cognitive science, but it's originally from evolution. Exaptation is where evolution takes something you already have, like your tongue, and uses it for a new purpose, because evolution is very efficient. So I'm using my tongue right now to talk, but it's not really designed for talking. Like my dog can't talk that I know of. She uses her tongue to drink water and move food around. So we can take the same skills, the mindfulness, the discernment, the curiosity that we use to navigate a psychedelic experience well, to go really deep into our psyches, to get a deeper, richer sense of what reality may be, and we can apply them to actually making sense of an incredibly complex, contradictory, intense 2023 environment that we all find ourselves in, particularly trying to make sense of the information landscape online, but also just really trying to make sense of the huge cultural and social changes we're living through.
Yeah, that's fascinating as a kind of starter for 10. And as you're talking, I'm thinking how quite literally psychedelics, like like, is it advisable to be, you know, at what stage does the sense making occur when intersecting with psychedelics? You know, I almost imagine that I wouldn't be anywhere near an internet device at the point of a psychedelic experience, and although I'd be interested to see what would happen. But how do you see psychedelics in the direct role, like, you know, in terms of the actual physical experience, like the physical experience of, say, having a trip through whatever means, whether we're talking psilocybin or DMT, or at what point does the individual, or is the individual able to start to use that unique experience to actually navigate the external realities? Because for me personally, I've found it a useful tool to really firstly identify with internal realities and make sense in that regard. But you're right, the tumultuous time of 2023 and this unique point in history, where does that point of the actual individual experience and the ability to discern what's happening in the world connect?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One answer, or one part of the answer to that question, is we're not entirely sure yet, because we still haven't developed protocols and run studies where we're, say, for example, something I would love to do in the future, take a systems level problem or a very complex problem and have a group try and find new solutions to that problem. There's been creativity research which kind of touches on something like that, and with interesting results. But I think there's just so much scope and potential to dive into that. Now, my initial sense of it is that immediately during or after the experience, we're usually dealing with and going through our own inner world, wrestling with different aspects of our personality, having, you know, deep emotional insights, and so we're really in a space where we're making sense of ourselves. Now, I think it's later, after that has been sufficiently integrated into our lives, that we can then take what was the skills we were using in a state and start making them, turning them into a trait, a way that we see the world. So a way of approaching the world that is, in essence, psychedelic, even if we're not on the drug, which means also it's accessible to people without ever taking a psychedelic. And there's a kind of, it's interesting, I've asked lots of people, what do you think is, like, what makes something psychedelic beyond the drug experience? Like, what makes something psychedelic? And people give different answers, but there's a lot of similarities. And one sense is that there's a sense of holding things lightly. There's a humor in it. There's an understanding of complexity is something that I think is absolutely key, and something I talk about in the book. Understanding that the way complex systems work, because I think what psychedelics do, one of the things, is give us a lived experience of complexity. So we feel complexity. We see how things are impacting other things. We see how something can be multiple things at the same time, and we can absolutely we start making sense in a new way. We move out of rigid thinking into a much more fluid, much more fluid and flexible way of thinking. So that flexibility, again, is really key. And that's absolutely key for making sense of complex problems, whether that's, you know, the entire big meta crisis we're facing right now, of all the overlapping crises of climate change, meaning crisis, mental health crisis, war in Ukraine, nuclear proliferation, all these things that are happening at the same time in a system that is not really designed, or has no intelligence left to really deal with them. We need to sort of, I think, in some sense, do the same thing that happens when we individually take psychedelics, which is we break the old frame and make a new frame, and instead somehow find a way to do that on the systems level. Now, that's a massive ask, and no one knows how to do that. And I'm also not claiming that psychedelics necessarily, they're certainly not the only tool we need. We need a lot, but I think they can help put us in the right kind of mindset to at least start doing it better than we are now.
Yeah. The conference I was at on Sunday, the Better Way conference in Bath, Matthias Desmet was there, who's a psychologist from Belgium. He's writing a new book called The Art of Truth Telling. And he spoke about some of the latest insights in how the beginning to observe the connection between almost the intuitive understanding of the world, the inner understanding of the world, and the intersection with the outer observable reality. and starting to see how there is increasing evidence that the more we are able to hone our ability to discern that intuitive awareness and clarify that intuitive awareness, it actually starts to connect with observable realities. And he's started to show how many scientific breakthroughs in history have come from that connection between the unseen and the seen. So I'm wondering, as you were talking, whether the notion of as within, so without, whether psychedelics, through sharpening our senses and our ability to perceive our inner world and make sense of our own mind, whether that could indeed, therefore, sharpen our mind to make sense of the outer world, whether what he is postulating or putting forth could actually play out and be enhanced by the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, that's a really cool. I didn't know about his new book, or that he's working on one. But I know about mass formation psychosis. That's his. That was his idea, wasn't it? Yeah. I mean, my short answer is yeah, definitely. I mean, like the. I mean, there's a problem at the heart of metaphysics in the West, right? Because we have a metaphysics which is based on. Sorry, my screen has just gone off for some odd reason. I might have affected my camera. So we have a metaphysics based on physicalism, right? So physicalism argues that what is real is matter, and anything that's not, so consciousnness, which is a qualitative aspect of experience, can't be measured, can't be quantified, so it's not real. And that's a remnant of the Enlightenment, and it's, in my opinion, in my opinion, not supported empirically. I think a worldview that can't account for consciousness as anything other than a byproduct is massively limited, and also at odds with a lot of what we're figuring out from quantum physics. So the way that relates to the question you had is that if we take his idea seriously, that we can kind of access kind of inner states that are then going to be applicable to the outside world, it makes perfect sense. It's very confusing in physicalism, because
yes.
they're like, yeah, but your inner state is like not a thing. You don't have free will. Nothing matters. You're just a dead meat machine, and consciousness is a byproduct. So then it becomes quite a difficult argument to make. But if you take a more idealist or panpsychist perspective that sees consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality, then it really does make sense, because we're experiencing different levels of consciousness, different aspects of consciousness. And so it's perfectly plausible that what we do in one state can be applied to another state effectively. Now, there are limits to that as well. But of course, natural limits about the laws of physics, etc., that might not apply in a psychedelic experience, but will apply in the real world. But certainly, most of our problems are problems on the levels of needing new ideas and new ways to do things, right? So, I mean, obviously we have resource problems, etc., but we actually have really resource distribution problems, especially. We have deep cultural problems at a really fundamental level. So that means that basically, when we're in a psychedelic experience and we're in a kind of thought experience, a thought and feeling experience, that's exactly the place we need to be honing our skills and then applying them to the world.
Yeah. So my first kind of intrigue around psychedelics, I suppose, was within my early teens, though I didn't actually have a practical experience. But I look back, or late teens rather, I look back at the kind of the 60s and the summer of love and the role that psychedelics played during that time. And I look through that from a cultural fascination as well as a kind of, in many ways, an appreciation of the music and, what was trying to be accomplished. And now in these times, I draw parallels to that time where it almost felt like there was a tectonic shift in culture. And it feels like we're approaching another tectonic shift, whether that's just like a rumbling of the plates or whether we're going to see some kind of now, eruption. But I always looked at fascination, and it felt like at that time, whilst you had pioneers like Timothy Leary and others like Richard Alpin, Ram Dass, who were looking at this both scientifically but also experimentally in a social context. I wonder if you would cast light or shed light on what your views are on that period in time in terms of the early understandings that have been developed. And I know that psychedelics quite clearly predate that period, but it certainly came to prominence within Western culture at a scale that I don't think we'd seen before. You might correct me on that, but could you share a comment on what your perceptions were of the understandings that were initially made during that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that I talk about in the book as well, because I'm fascinated by that whole era, and especially the combination of revolutionary ideas, and not just psychedelics, but consciousness alteration, and how those things intersect. So there's this story that I relate in the book about Timothy Leary that I think kind of points to some of the complexities here. So Leary was, this is from a podcast, by the way, about the Weathermen called Mother Country Radicals, which is fantastic. It's done by one of the son of Bernadette Dorn, who was, Timothy Leary was the most dangerous man in America, Nixon called him. And Bernadine Dorn was the most dangerous woman in America because she led the Weathermen, right? And she, so the Weathermen were not particularly into psychedelics. They were very politically focused and kind of very politically active, and really focused on the Black liberation movement, as well as generally overthrowing what they saw as a very extractive and damaging, system in general. So the Weathermen, for various reasons, which is really worth checking the podcast out because it was quite a crazy time, they decided to break Timothy Leary out of jail. Like, a group wanted to break him out of jail, and they were like, who do we ask to help us? So the Weathermen. So there's almost like they were doing it as like a job in GTA, right?
Yeah.
Of course, there was some kind of alignment. Obviously, they were sort of aligned. So they do that successfully. They break Timothy Leary out of jail, and then they send him to Algeria, where the leadership of the Black Panthers was basically in exile. And then they play this on the podcast. It's brilliant. You have Eldridge Cleaver, who was the leader of the Black Panthers at the time, saying to the Weathermen, he's like, listen, we love you guys. You're allies of ours in the same kind of common struggle. But this guy Leary and his wife effectively are nuts. He's like, I think they've taken too much acid. And basically get them out of here. But what's interesting about it is that it's like, okay, why? What was going on? And Leary was basically spouting the idea that if we can just raise everyone's consciousness, and if everyone takes LSD and then we will basically, that's going to solve the problem. And for someone like Eldridge Cleaver, who was dealing with like real political, really deep-seated racism, really deep-seated political inequalities, and his friends are literally getting shot and fighting the police, and they're struggling for sort of basic rights. The idea seemed kind of ludicrous, and it is, because it's a bypass, right? It's like a kind of, we'll just basically everything will fix itself. And it's very easy for Leary to say, as a kind of rich psychiatrist who's sort of like, spends his time thinking about things, that that's a solution. So I think that was part of the problem with the link between psychedelics and revolution. And also in that section of the book, I talk about something more current, which is my friend Leo Roseman's study on Palestinians and Israelis who drink ayahuasca together. He's a neuroscientist at Imperial College, and he did a study where they did like kind of ethnographic research on the groups, and these are groups of Israelis and Palestinians who kind of happened to be drinking in the same groups, right? They weren't doing it for like conflict resolution purposes, but then he took them out to Spain specifically to do it for conflict resolution, right? And that study hasn't come out yet, but I was living next door to him when he was doing it, so I luckily was able to interview him and include it in the book. But I think it just speaks to a much more realistic way in which we can look at psychedelics as they relate to sort of changing the system. Because what would happen is that there were these moments when they were drinking together, where they would feel like, okay, all is one, and the conflict is really like, it's basically from this space of unity. What is the conflict? We're all connected. It's so beautiful. And then someone would start, they ran these quite open ceremonies, so it was quite fluid. Anyone could sing. And then someone would start singing in Arabic, and an Israeli would just get massively triggered, and it would be like all the unity is gone, and there's like a kind of tension point, and they would work with that and sort of wrestle it through and process stuff. And one of the things that came out of his research is that the idea of like all is one, that spiritual sense or idea, is actually kind of counter-revolutionary in many ways, and it doesn't like, or can be, because what it does is it masks the realities of the conflict. Because of course they could feel all is one in the ceremony, but then be like, when we go back to Italy, yeah, when we go back to Israel, the political reality hasn't changed at all, and a lot of them found it quite difficult to sort of navigate that. So that, I think, but what is beautiful about it is that they also did really deeply connect with each other, and some of them moved even to the same town when they moved back. Like they moved house so they could all kind of stay connected, like help each other moving, and all this really beautiful stuff. So it's almost like there was a piece missing of going to that really gritty human complexity of how do we actually meet and change a system that was missing in the 60s, I think. I'm sure it was happening in some places, but certainly from the top level, it was all very sort of like Eastern spirituality focused, right? So it was all like transcend. And I think now with more maturity, we can move it towards let's engage with the complexity of what it actually means to challenge a system or to change a system, and do the nitty gritty work, which is what psychedelics actually help us do. It's like there's no escape, there's no bypassing, just straight towards the pain.
I wonder, in the way you frame that, whether that actually underscores what we were talking about previously, in the sense that in that ceremony where you got that kind of trigger moment, and I've been thinking about this in the context of all the various different ways that people are looking at the intersecting crises, the big crisis, the meta crisis, whatever you want to, perma crisis, whatever you want to call it or label it, and taking it down to that particular crisis and how our perception of reality is ultimately shaped to a large extent by external factors and the media and social media, the web, and in ways that we perhaps historically have not had that volume of information to make sense of. And now it feels like almost every corner we turn on, there's a new crisis, and everything's amped up to a crisis very quickly. And not to dismiss that there aren't problems, of course. But I wonder whether that person's triggered reaction, that's an internal reaction to an externally programmed. Again, I'm not saying that in a way to take away the genuine conflict, but that person's interpretation and perception of the conflict in that setting where previously they felt a sense of all is one. Does that play into the idea that when we start to make sense of the world, that actually our inner perception is what creates or potentially contributes to the outer conflict, the inner conflict? Is it the case that the inner conflict is a reflection of the outer conflict, or is it an ever interrelating experience between the outer and the inner? And where does psychedelics fit into that relationship? This is what I'm thinking as you were speaking.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I think, like you said, it's definitely a dynamic relationship, and that's what is missed when they were saying like all is one. It's like, yes, that's also true, I think, but also it what often happens in those kind of communities is kind of moving away from the world and moving a retreat from the world. But actually the reality that they couldn't escape from is what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and what the political reality is on the ground. That's an inescapable fact, right? So no matter how hippy dippy you get about it, it doesn't change that. And that was actually, and so that means that's true, so you have to deal with the truth of what's real and start from there and go from there. So I think that that it's also really important to have a sense of that there is such a thing as truth.
Yes.
Especially when talking about psychedelics, because they deconstruct our perceptual models so intensely, but I think with a healthy connection to a groundedness in reality, which can often come through the body. Embodiment's very important, because our body is absolutely here and real. If it wasn't, couldn't be thinking or having any experience in the first place. Without that sort of ground of something to deconstruct into, deconstruction leads to madness, which is what we've seen since 2016 and longer than that. The urge to deconstruct everything in society, I actually think it's a healthy urge. I think deconstruction is healthy. I think it's critical. It's interesting. The problem is deconstructing without something that is essential underneath it. So I think it's very important that there's a kind of the kind of both and of that.
Yes. Yeah, that seems to be a common thing that's coming through most of my conversations recently, is both and. Yeah. Now, we touched upon the 60s and the counterculture, the interesting perspectives. What lasting impact do you think psychedelics? Do you think it can play a role in elevating our consciousness? Can psychedelics help our consciousness to evolve in the way? I suppose it'd be useful to quantify in that context how you define consciousness, which is, I know, the eternal struggle, but I'd be curious. Did we materially move and evolve subsequent to that period? And did psychedelics contribute to that?
So your audio cut out in a crucial moment in that. It's just like, could you repeat the question? Just
sorry, I literally knocked the wire out of my mic.
Okay.
It looked like it had gone to my backup mic, but it hadn't. So I was asking about, do you think psychedelics actually played a role? Can it play a role in actually elevating our consciousness? Is there evidence during that particular moment in time, those unique struggles and the kind of the social and cultural revolutionary period, did psychedelics actually materially play a role in elevating the consciousness of the people in that time? And if so, like, how do you quantify that? How do you qualify what consciousness is in order to be able to say that psychedelics played a role in actually evolving our consciousness as a culture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was really curious about that when I was writing the book. When I spoke to Eric Davis, who is an author and religious, got a PhD in religious studies, I believe. And also just a brilliant thinker. And he was saying that he thinks the main contribution from that period was in kind of switching a lot of people on to the kind of practices like meditation and yoga, and a kind of openness to those practices. And an openness to self-inquiry and great, practices that help us with greater self-awareness. So he kind of saw that as one of the main contributions. Now, I think there are others, and I'm sure Eric would probably speak to others as well. I think it's what raising consciousness is, like you pointed to this, is really tricky. Like, what do we mean by when we say raising consciousness? Because we need some kind of, did it make us more aware as a culture? I think probably it did. I think there was a lot of other stuff going on that wasn't to do with psychedelics, like the civil rights movement, which was pretty fundamental and would have happened without psychedelics as well. I think psychedelics really enhanced that, and they also opened people up to being able to break free of the rigidity. Again, this is a common theme of psychedelics, to break out of the rigid structures of the 1950s, say, where like you were just so restricted, the ways you could express yourself, the ideas you could entertain, the kind of social systems that you could propose. So I think it really helped a lot of the sort of like what we would now call influencers of the time to really break out. And it had a huge impact on music as well. And music obviously is incredibly powerful social carrier of new ideas. So I think in a lot of ways it did have an impact. At the same time, there was when you research the Summer of Love and you research like 1967 to 69, what was happening in San Francisco, it was really a youth movement, like a really young youth movement. There's this, Joan Didion has a famous essay called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And she went to San Francisco in, I believe it was 67, and she did a kind of gonzo, like, proper, really, I mean, she's a phenomenal writer, really worth checking out. But she spoke to the leaders of the movement. She spoke to the kind of main thinkers, people who are putting up flyers and hate Ashbury and everyone. And there's this line in it where she's speaking to someone and they're like, how old are you? And she's like, I'm 30. And the guy like nods his head and goes, oh, that's okay. There's old hippies too.
Yes, right.
Because they're all really like, 14 to sort of 18 was like, like people like 14-year-olds were going from whatever, like a farm in Iowa and like rocking up in San Francisco and getting completely taken advantage of. There was a lot of speed and amphetamines as much as there was acid. There was a lot of pretty horrific sexual abuse and predatory behavior. So the underbelly of it was actually pretty grim. And then you had people like Ram Dass and these amazing kind of figures who were also kind of, connecting to that higher level of what it could be. So it was really a mixed bag from what I can gather of that time. And I'm speaking to people, who were there as well. I've done a lot of that, speaking to people in my life who were there and lived through it. And, what was the civil rights movement and gender equality and all of that changing culture. That was what was going on mainly. And even the psychedelic side was kind of fringe still, so, but it did have I think, outsized impact, I would say.
Yeah. Now I'm keen to draw comparisons with today and really in the context and the lens of counterculture, particularly looking at systems change, with the conversation around the kind of big, messy, complex problems that we've got. Everything from social, cultural problems that we're seeing kind of play out in the kind of various narratives across things that actually may have begun in the 60s. Conversations around gender, sexuality, and those pieces are playing out in the kind of culture wars, right through to environmental issues, corporate issues, the rise of authoritarianism, existential threats of technology. There's just so many things that we could look at, but that also plays into the kind of perception of reality that I was touching upon, because a lot of the time I think, how much do we amplify that to be more alarming than it actually is? And it feels like through history we have these periods where something is emergent and we raise it up to be significant, and then we look back in history and go, well, actually it wasn't quite as bad as we thought, but at the time it felt intense and it never quite played out how we thought. So there's that perception element. But I'm looking at now in the counterculture, again, the counterculture that I've kind of been part of within the last couple of years, looking at kind of the shifts, the rise of centralized, globalized influences over kind of world matters, the kind of exposure of corruption, the kind of emergence of widespread censorship and erosion of free speech. And the individuals that are largely taking a stand on these three C's, centralization, corruption, and censorship, are of an older generation. It's the counterculture of today is an older generation in a way, but it's not the only counterculture. There's like a blurring of many countercultures. And psychedelics are kind of on the edges at the moment. You've got people like Aubrey Marcus, who's very much talking about this in the course of what he's doing, and various others. But it's not a youth movement that's driving it. And we drew a comparison. I was talking to Robin Minotti about this. He's a filmmaker. And we speculated whether the equivalent period in time is the 1950s, and we're the beat poets that precede the youth movement of the next decade. And that's the equivalent of the, maybe this is the foundations of something that's building. But I'm curious to see how, in the context of those periods, both from a lens of counterculture and tackling issues of the time, and then overlaying that with psychedelics, your observations of the two periods in time.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I do think, just on the point of like generations and generational values, I do think there's a shift happening with whatever generation was, let's say, I don't know what ages I'm exactly thinking about, young in their 20s and entering the workforce in, say, 2015 to maybe now. I think that, and this is really this is difficult, because I don't want to like say an entire generation is one thing or another. I think that's really like
Yes.
Doesn't work. But, however, at the same time, I think there is that particular swathe for various reasons. Maybe primarily because they grew up with social media and were the first to grow up with social media. I think that generation in particular is quite conformist and easily and basically has that kind of pro-censorship stance, and is on the whole, as a generation, not necessarily all individuals in that, just to caveat that again, sensitive, valuing safety over inquiry, etc. Everything we've been seeing, the most problematic aspects of the social justice movements in the last, 6 or 7 years. I think it's interesting that I'm not sure that people who are in university now are necessarily like that, because, and there's a few things I think might be going on, because, Kathleen Stock just did this kind of Oxford talk, and she wrote an article being like, actually, the students were very open to a different approach on, feminism, and they weren't shouting turf at her and like up in arms.
Yeah.
Actually, the kind of university lecturers who are embedded in this like extreme ideology, and the students were a lot more open-minded. That's not the first time I've heard that recently. And I do wonder, this is very speculative, but I do wonder if in fact what you were touching on before is correct, that there is the new generation who've got like a little bit more, got their heads around social media. I think their humor is quite interesting as well. Like the Zoomer kind of humor is quite ironic and complex. And I think that's probably quite a good sign. I think and I think also what's happening now is that there's a significant pushback going on in a lot of different areas of society, including even, I think, media. We're going to see more movies being less kind of pandering and doing sort of like really crass diversity focus that isn't actually honoring anyone, but is just kind of picking a box. Like, I think there's such a pushback to that, and it's not making money.
Yes.
I think that, and it's, it's important to remember that the writing rooms and the companies were staffed by that particular generation. So I don't, again, this is quite thinking out loud and speculative, and I'm sure there's solid counter arguments as to why that generation isn't like that. But that was certainly been my experience. That's at least something I'm tracking and wondering about at the moment.
Yeah, I'm curious about all of that. Now with that kind of almost mass pushback against some of these, and it almost feels like, just started listening to a podcast called The Fall of Civilizations, and it's really fascinating looking at the patterns in history where, almost people think about societal collapse as like usually ending in war and but it doesn't always end that way, or a stark revolution. But there is always a revolt of some kind, it seems, and there are these kind of erosion of moral norms and conventions, and it feels a bit like we're going through that sort of time right now. But I'd be curious to know your perception of where psychedelics are already playing a role and whether they will increase, because you've given some interesting perspectives that I hadn't considered on the kind of 60s. I'd always associated almost the latter part, the death of that period of time. I definitely could see how things turned sour and became dark very quickly. But looking at the earliest, the kind of hope that came from that period, and whether psychedelics played a role in bringing that sense of youthful optimism, wondering whether we need a stroke of that now, but also recognizing that there's that, as you said, it was youthful, it was wild, it was experimental. And now when I see psychedelics, I see it in a very different lens, like almost institutionalized, like big pharma coming into it, constraining it, trying to measure it completely, ignoring any potential subjective or more esoteric part. And I'm concerned about that. I'll level with you, as well as like hopeful, because I also hope that for treating kind of mental disorders and anxieties and depressions, that there will come away, a space that creates the kind of safety of mind and stability of mind that's required perhaps for those conditions. But at the same time, that experimental element perhaps lost. So I know I've kind of unraveled a lot of things there, but I think there is some intersection with the kind of counterculture of the past and the counterculture of the moment, the free reign, the free flowing experience of the past, and now this almost constrained experience. I'm just really interested in your comments of those almost contrasting periods.
Yeah, no, I think you're right in that, of course, as well as the problems and the sort of delusions of this kind of psychedelic 60s, it was a pretty astonishing development socially as well, right? So, and I really love that, like the optimism. I think we're missing a lot of optimism. It's when after 9/11, lots of films started becoming gritty remakes. It's like Batman is like gritty. Everything was like a gritty remake. And I think the art obviously like reflects the times a lot. But I think that what we're living through now is like, well, now the theme is multiverse, right? It's this kind of like cacophony of multiple perspectives. And, someone told me the other day that there isn't really like a fashion of the 2020s. It's just everyone wears whatever they want. So you'll be like, there's someone with 70s flares, there's someone dressed like they're in the 1920s, that, so there is this kind of like, which is kind of cool. Like I'm into that, right? It's interesting. It's interesting. So I do think there's probably good creative bedrock for, this is my hope as well. And this is something I really want to be involved with is to kind of like find what is the new psychedelic counterculture, because it's just disappeared really. That when I've been involved in the space since 2007 or so, in terms of like doing podcasts and writing and whatnot. And at that time, it was so fringe, and we were on internet forums pre-social media, and it was absolutely wonderful. You really cut my teeth on like debating and like talking metaphysics and politics, and like it was amazing. And we all shared something which was a little bit intangible, but it was a sense of like a deep connection to and love for psychedelics and what they open up, and the experience and the lore around them, the mystique, the thinkers. And that was what I would have defined as the psychedelic counterculture. It was like 5 websites, right? And some books, obscure books. And now it's so different, right? Because what I wrote about this, I made a couple of films on it, this concept of the psychedelic Trojan horse, because and I totally get why this happened, and maybe it needed to happen. And, I'm not saying it was necessarily a bad thing, but what all the researchers did, who themselves, are the kind of psychedelic underground or like counterculture, they hold those hopes, right, for the transformative power of psychedelics, like psychedelics can transform culture, right? And they were like, they made kind of a decision, and I almost watched it happen and heard the conversations of like, okay, we need to basically stop being challenging or weird so that we can get it through the medical system, in the Trojan horse of medicalization. And then once it's in the system, then you open the Trojan horse. Now psychedelics are in society, and like, great, everything's transformed. Now that's not how things work, and especially because psychedelics, the container they're in, the horse, is as important as the psychedelics, because they're so heavily influenced by our cultural expectations, by our set, by our value systems. I don't think they're values neutral, but I think they're very close to values neutral. I think they elicit some experiences which will make us more connected, compassionate, open-minded, but they won't necessarily, because there's plenty of people who take psychedelics who are the exact opposite of that. And there's also plenty of groups who take psychedelics for vastly different political or social motivations. So if you go medicalization, what you get is rigid, boring, like limited use of psychedelics that takes away specifically the transformative potential of them, because and this isn't to say that people in the space don't still have that, but what it means is that the name of the game and the value capture that's going on is you can't simultaneously say we're working on pioneering new mental health treatments and we want to completely rework capitalism so that these experiences can be had by many people, and that what we're learning from them can be implemented in the way we run our societies. You can't do both those things. Mm-hmm. You can't, because there's a value clash there, and what's going to win is the capitalist medical system. So, however, there's also many other expressions of the way we can access psychedelics, thankfully, that are beyond just the medical version of it. And so if that weren't the case, then we would be facing a kind of psychedelic dystopia. Also, a lot of the companies that, when I was writing those pieces, sort of in the 2020s, in early 2020, this is when there was this huge influx of money into the psychedelic space by loads of people, many of whom had absolutely no idea what they were doing. And the market cap from a presentation that was at Breaking Convention from a venture capitalist that was in one of my symposia. It's basically halved because so many people have been like, oh, this isn't a get rich quick scheme. It's not like cannabis. It's not like, and then so that's really good. It's really slowed down.
Yeah.
A lot of the early kind of gold rush people have gone away, thank God, because to be really blunt about it, they weren't welcome in the first place.
Yes.
And they're trying to basically take sacred medicines and use the same attitude as a Bitcoin investment campaign to sort of jack it up. So I'm very grateful for that. And now I think there's a really great opportunity to really look at, well, how else could we access them? There's groups in America. There's a group called Ligare, it's a preacher, a Christian preacher, and he's exploring and bringing other clergy together for psychedelic Christianity. And there's psychedelic Hindu groups that I've heard about. There's so many different expressions. And there's of course retreats. I run Legal Retreat in the Netherlands. There's so many different ways to access psychedelics. I still think the clinical is very important for people with who are struggling with mental health problems that need clinical intervention. It's not, again, another theme of the conversation. It's not an either or. It's a yes.
Yes. Yeah. You've opened up so many doors. We haven't got time to go down all these holes, but because I'll plant a seed for another conversation in the future, whether it's recorded or not, because the context of using psychedelics in a spiritual sense and a religious sense, there's so much to unpack there, because I found there has been quite a bit of skepticism amongst some of the traditional religious communities about the use case. I've seen it in both sides, because I've seen even things like meditation. I've seen some resist meditation, but I've seen others approach it and see the conversation of God, etc., is a big conversation, but some have said that it's enhanced their connection to their God and their perception of God and their relationship with God. And of course, then those who are perhaps atheists have a different experience with something beyond themselves and the divine, and these other experiences, which is just such a big conversation. So I if you have a soundbite to drop into that, then go there, we can go there. But before you do that, I would, before we wrap up our session, I kind of want to get a sense of the flow of the book, because I'm really curious. Obviously I've got it on pre-order as well, and encourage anyone who's watching this to grab a copy. It's coming out on Tuesday, but I'm really curious about the approach you've taken to the flow of the book. But if you do have like a one-liner to that really complex set of issues, then feel free to give a comment.
Yeah, I do maybe have a one-liner that can do justice to it's not going to do justice, but it's at least I touch on it, and we can explore it another time. But yeah, I think what is really important is that we can move it away from religious or non-religious, etc., and just focus on the sacred. Yeah. Because the idea of the sacred is applicable to, at least in certain branches of sociology, the sacred is anything that we hold as a higher value beyond the social game, right? So human life is something we see as sacred in society. The divine, God, is sacred to many people. For atheists, it could be something completely different. It could be rationality. It could also be your football team. Something that's like, I often use the example of like, if you got someone, it's like the I don't know, Champions League final, and their team is like in penalties, right? The penalty shootout, and then if you had a thought experiment, you could be like, I'll give you, £1 million, maybe not 1 million, there'll be some number, but let's say we'll give you 50 grand. And if you take that 50 grand, your team's going to lose for sure. In that moment of like imagine you've been supporting that team your entire life, and this is the first time they've ever been in the Champions League. I think a lot of people would turn down that money, right? Yeah. It's more important than some things are more important than money. Just like if someone was like, I'll give you £50,000 to like kill that dog, I would be like, no, I'm not going to do that. Or like, let alone a person, right?
Yes.
So the sacred is really important, because that allows us to talk about what matters most to us beyond our individual conceptions of whatever that might be, because none of us really know, right? And that's a really beautiful thing. And psychedelics reliably connect us to the sacred. That's something that is consistent, whether people are atheists or whether they are religious. They have an experience of deep connection and meaning, which is absolutely the most important thing about them, I would say. It's why all of this is happening, is that they connect us to something beyond ourselves. It's exactly what our society needs right now, It's exactly what we need as individuals, I think, to even be sane. And so I think that's my sound battle gift for that bit. And now I've forgotten the.
So I'm curious about how you approach the flow of the book.
Oh yes, yeah.
From the introduction, you got then 6 core chapters before conclusion. I don't want to give a spoiler alert on the conclusion, but I am curious to see how you approach the flow of the.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I've written the book really for people who've potentially never heard of psychedelics, so that it's accessible for that, right? I would say it's like a pop science book and maybe a pop philosophy book. So the first chapter is about what are psychedelics and why, like how do they actually change our minds? So looking at the neuroscience and the cognitive science, but I also look at, so I was a participant on a world first study at Imperial College called DMT Extended State, where we were pumped full of the world's most powerful psychedelic for 4 times longer than you would normally have the experience. And it was very profound, and I used it as, I wanted like a narrative thread for the book beyond just like ideas. So I use that as a narrative thread. So it's about like 75% of the book is sort of big ideas and like kind of cultural analysis, and then the rest of it is those experiences which were absolutely out of this world, and trying to take some of those insights, which were potentially my personal insights, and go, okay, not so much me applying my personal insights to the kind of bigger picture of things, but going, what can we learn from experiences like this? What can we actually see? Like, what is actually going on in these experiences, and how do they help us make sense of the world as it is? So first chapter is about how psychedelics work. The second chapter is called The Big Crisis, which is my word for what some people call the meta crisis, which is something we've touched on, which is basically, why is the world so fucked right now? What are we going to do about it? So a lot of looking at that. I also include a lot of practices, sense-making practices, because that's really kind of a big part of my background. Like, how do we actually look at misinformation? How do we make sense of the culture wars, all of that, and where do psychedelics fit in? So that's that was probably the most complicated chapter to write. I also, in fact, talk a lot about complex systems in there, why we need to understand complex systems, and understand the difference between complex and complicated. Then the third chapter is all about the internet and AI. I'm stoked that I focused so much on AI, because I wrote the AI chapter last April, I think. Well, just after Blake Lemoine, the Google engineer, claimed that Lambda, the chatbot he was working on, is conscious, and he hired a lawyer and he got fired. That was the precursor for everything getting much, much more intense and weird. And I had a feeling it would. So I was quite happy about that. Also, it just fit very well, because the DMT experience is really defined by, at least in part, people have this experience of encountering beings that seem to be real and alive and want to talk to us and communicate with us, or don't give a shit that we're there. It's a really fascinating phenomena. And that's really what we're experiencing on the internet right now. Like, I don't know if I'm talking to, there could be people who are in this chat who are chatbots, right? Yeah. And so it's this kind of discernment we need to be like, what is consciousness actually? Like, how do I know? Like, what's the experience of interacting with something that seems to be conscious but might not be? That's an experience that's like massive in the DMT experience, and suddenly major concern for every single person on the planet now. And then also the internet more broadly, because I think the internet is like an altered state of its own. It's like changes how we think. It changes the way we interact. It constrains how we can behave, what we can say, the way we can say it, whether that's a character account or whether it's just the nature of online communication. The fourth chapter is all about the dark side of psychedelics and the dark side of culture. So I talk a lot about the culture wars. I talk about identity politics, actually. I talk about delusion and getting stuck in ideological echo chambers, because psychedelics can make that way worse. So yeah, and that was also... I actually really enjoyed writing. I enjoyed writing the whole book. I actually had a blast writing the whole thing. That chapter in particular was the most delicate one to kind of try and speak to a general audience about these issues, which are really contentious as well.
Yes.
The fifth and sixth chapters are really, one's called A New Reality, the fifth chapter, and that's about like, okay, well, how do we apply this to systems change? And then the 6th chapter is called A Reverential Revolution, which is looking at, as well at both of those chapters, kind of looking at like, how do we actually potentially change systems? You know, trying to take a realistic view of that, which is, again, we can't just put acid in the water supply, or even if everyone on the planet takes psychedelics, it's not going to do it. It's about how we use it and how we show up and how we actually approach our collective problems. So yeah, that's the book.
I love the way actually, that's why I was really curious, the flow, like, the fact that you enter into the mud as well through the dark side and then lift it back up into its practical application and the hopeful optimism, in fact, that we touched upon that was needed.
Yeah, and interestingly, my DMT dosings followed that trajectory because they were really sequential. Like my first 3 dosings, well, the first one was a placebo, but the first 3 actual dosings, which was meant to be the whole trial, was there was a kind of theme about, you know, my own inner world and my own relationship to my emotions, and intimacy in particular was a big theme. But there's also a lot of wild entity encounters and metaphysical stuff happening as well. And then they were like, that's it, the study's done. And I was like, I'd already started writing the book, and I was like, okay, how am I going to weave in the dosings? Because my last dosing had a kind of completion to it, but I didn't get that full metaphysical breakthrough of, like, you know, the absolute depth of the DMT realm, and trying to make, while I was really curious, like I felt like I wanted to be like an astronaut, like really be like, what's going on here? And then they got in touch about 6 months later, and they were like, they didn't say it, but I gathered they had cracked the dosing, and they were like, do you want to come in for a final dose? And I was like, yes, definitely. That dose was absolutely phenomenal and answered a lot of questions I had. And so that was like, became the perfect last chapter. So it was kind of beautiful because it went on this trajectory where I was like, shit, I didn't necessarily, it was a beautiful experience, but I didn't quite get that thing I was looking for. And then suddenly there was like a kind of like, yes, amazing, another chance. And it was out of this world. That final dosing was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had. So I talk about that in detail in the last chapter as well.
Oh, I'm gonna have to read it backwards. That's a great way to end. Massive curiosity at the end of the
conversation. I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Alexander, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this. I mean, there's all the way through. There's just been, I need to come to London and spend some time with it, because there's just so many trajectories I'd like to just continue on. So thank you so much. And your book is coming out on Tuesday. It's available to pre-order now. I've just pre-ordered it myself. It's available, Alexander, on all of the major platforms, isn't it?
Waterstones, Amazon, Audible, and if you pre-order, I'm pretty sure that it arrives on the day.
It does,
it comes out. So yeah.
Awesome. So whether you want to read or whether you want to listen, the opportunity is available there for us, for you. Please do share this episode. We're increasingly experiencing censorship of our content. It's a very difficult time. So if you in your communities have been talking with people about the role that psychedelics and plant-based medicine can play in this unique period in time, or you're just fascinated about the possible experience yourself, please do tag in the comments of this episode so that we can help people have some beginning to begin to explore this subject, because I'm really curious how this will unfold, how psychedelics will unfold, and how they will play perhaps a role a little bit differently this time from the 1960s, but perhaps still be a central component. We will see. So, Alexander, thanks again for being here on the Elevate podcast. It's been a wonderful conversation, and really hope that you can hit that bestseller mark on Tuesday for the incredible work that you've done over the last, the work that you've done on the book, I know, has been going on without a book in mind for many years.
Yeah, it has actually. Yeah, but yeah, thanks a lot, Dan. It's been a pleasure to reconnect, and it's been a lot of fun. So thanks for that.